Backrooms is the film that the FNAF movies think they are. First off, Backrooms has immaculate presentation. From the first live-action shot, there is a very clear style that Parsons was going for that gives it a unique visual identity. The movie has some phenomenal establishing shots that manage to fill up the entire frame, which before the backrooms are even present, you can feel this sense of claustrophobia. The camera is always used to sustain this claustrophobia, even if the scene takes place in an open space. The production design is great. The backrooms themselves are accurately replicated practically, and there are a lot of practical effects that emulate the style of the source material authentically. I forgot the movie even had CGI sequences, but of course they're there considering Kane Parsons' previous work, and they meld with the live-action material seamlessly. Along with the visuals comes the audio, which is also spot on. The sound design adds to the claustrophobia by every moment being filled with audio, almost oppressively, where there's the hum of the fluorescent lights the entire time. And when the sound cuts out, it becomes even more eerie. But what really shines is the music, which is really great. It's eerie and menacing, but also hard to grasp onto. The presentation all feels intentional. The director is really given the opportunity to express his vision. With that comes the horror. It's pretty good. It's not as exploitative as films this nature tend to be. There's not an overabundance of jump scares or audio stingers. It relies on perpetual tension and uncertainty, and all the jump scares that are present are earned and clearly set up. The film is also well lit simply by the design of the backrooms, and as such, the horror comes in brightly lit sequences, and it's very welcomed. Too many movies hide their scares in the shadows, and they feel cheap, and while some sequences do rely on the darkness, the majority here do not. I also struggle to say that the movie is particularly scary, though it is very unsettling and tense. I found myself holding my breath more often than I was looking away from the screen. The movie is also not afraid to get pretty dark. Both protagonists have pretty mature stories, there is quite a lot of swearing throughout, and even some pretty explicit depictions of bloody violence. It's also not afraid to kill off characters, and since it has a small cast, it allows some amount of characterization for these characters before they die. Compare that to the FNAF movies, for example, which just throw in expendable doofuses so they can die while the protagonists can be completely unharmed. With that, the performances are pretty good. Chiwetel Ejiofor and Renate Rainsford give a lot and have some effective sequences, with the dining room scene particularly standing out. The side characters aren't as good as the leads, but they do give their best to fit their roles, and they succeed in doing so for the most part. While all the stuff that I've mentioned is great, I do think that the parts that aren't horror are less impactful. It feels like two different movies, a surreal intense mystery, and a pretty generic indie drama. The two stories do collide effectively, but the first act is almost entirely the indie drama, and it starts off on a weaker foot than where it leads. The second act is really good, and the third is decent, but starts to push a bit too far into the surreal that it loses me a little. But the movie shines when the characters are simply exploring the backrooms, and Parsons is able to indulge in his dreamlike visual palette. But, unfortunately, not a lot of the movie is that. The last two acts are set in the backrooms, but a lot of the time in the backrooms is dedicated to characters slowly pacing around. It's shot great and the production design is outstanding, but it gets a bit monotonous when what feels like a cumulative half hour is just walking around looking at nothing interesting. Then, another half hour is dedicated to the indie drama aspect of the movie that isn't that engaging. There is a theme that I've seen reviewers discuss about regeneration through memory that gets less accurate each time it's remembered, but the thematic value, beyond simply explaining the backrooms away, is both underdeveloped and ham-fisted. The reason why reviews are talking about it is because it's repeated multiple times throughout the movie, to the point that it feels like they were trying to make meaning out of what is essentially a cosmic horror entity. There is a lot of backstory that feels worthwhile for an A24 indie drama, but I'm not sure it works super well here. There are flashbacks for one of the characters, and the more subtle it is, like the scene after the title drop, the better it comes across. But the more it indulges in the backstories, it just feels like my time is being wasted. Like they didn't have enough faith in the audience to make a connection, or they failed to express a connection to the audience, so they keep adding more scenes until you finally get it. The movie also allocates time to stuff we don't particularly care about, but removes stuff that we would like to see. Iron Lung, another 2026 YouTuber movie, bloated its short runtime by showing us the process of exploring the Blood Moon, and that was a really effective way to expand the story. Clark, the protagonist in Backrooms, does this entirely off-screen and maps the backrooms between scenes. Stuff that we would like to see is skipped over in favor of devoting more time to therapy sessions and flashbacks. There's also some material that is cut away from that, when we return, the movie just acts like it never happened. It feels like the writer doesn't understand what stuff in a story is interesting, and instead we get a couple of vignettes that imply something interesting occurred between the last scene and the current one. Though the performances are mostly great, they aren't given terrific material. The dialogue is often hokey or cliché, and it feels like some random Hollywood writer came in and made the script, which is exactly what happened. Kane Parsons is only given a based on the series by writing credit, while Will Sudik wrote the script, someone with a total of 13 TV show episode writing credits. It definitely feels like it, as the dialogue and story itself is nothing remarkable or engaging, and it clashes with a distinct visual style. I get that Parsons' series doesn't really have a story, and it's more so a vessel for surreal visuals, but I feel he should have been granted better material than what feels like the studio trying to make the movie more generally appealing, but just comes off as condescending. What I'm getting at is that the movie is too long and spends too much time with the weaker elements. It's just under 2 hours, and it does not need to be. It would have been more effective if they cut back a bit, remove some of the repetitive exploring moments, cut down the out-of-backroom sequences, or anything to just make it more efficient. The movie requires you to be patient, and I usually have patience when it builds to something, but a lot of the time it builds up to basically nothing. Cut out a lot of Mary's backstory and the movie would work a lot better, as Clark's backstory is mostly through discussion and characterization, whereas Mary's is shown in prolonged sequences. Also, shrinking the first act or maybe removing the entire opening sequence could make the movie feel like it's dragging its feet less. But it is a good movie. It has a great use of practical and visual effects, gorgeous visual identity, performances that are great, and it's an effective horror flick. However, it tends to waste time as it goes on longer than it needs to, isn't particularly well written, and meanders often narratively, just like the characters in this nightmarish and claustrophobic setting. I can't wait for the Oldest View movie about a group of school students exploring an abandoned mall where they all have needlessly convoluted backstories that are only tangentially related to the story, if solely because I think that Parsons has a lot more to show us beyond Backrooms.